Okay, settle in, everyone.
Yeah.
Get comfortable. I want you to imagine for a moment, like you're opening an old book. You know the kind. Leather bound, feels heavy, smells like history, and it just seems to whisper about um, hidden knowledge, spiritual insights, just waiting inside.
That's a great way to put it, because that's really the feeling we're tapping into today, isn't it? We're
Yeah.
sort of opening the pages,
Yeah.
metaphorically anyway, of a really profound work, Spirit Teachings by
Oh.
William Stainton Moses.
Exactly. And this deep dive, it feels extra special to us because it's actually guided by the sources that you, our listener, shared with us. So a huge thank you for that. It lets us explore this truly fascinating material together.
It really does. And, for those of us who navigate these currents of the unseen world ourselves, who maybe felt those subtle nudges or even, more direct spirit communication, Stainton Moses is such a cornerstone figure.
He really is. The material you sent paints such a vivid picture. Here's a man who started from a place that, honestly, a lot of us can probably relate to. Deep religious interest, sure, but also, initially at least, massively skeptical about anything called spiritualism.
Mm-hmm. He pretty much saw it, as the sources say, as trickery and fraud. Plain and simple. But the interesting thing is, he wasn't coming from ignorance. He'd read immensely on religious subjects.
Right, so it's that combination, isn't it? A searching mind, but also a really critical eye.
Exactly. And that internal searching, that kind of wrestling with the established church doctrines he knew, that led him eventually to a point where, well, his astounding experiences, as the sources put it, began.
Experiences that were so profound, so undeniable for him that they eventually just, well, steered him away from the conventional path he was on. It's a journey so many people who seriously explore spirituality today recognize, I think. That gradual, sometimes really challenging shift in belief that comes from direct personal encounters.
Precisely. And for us, as fellow explorers in these realms, Moses's path, his experiences, and especially the teachings he received, particularly from his guide Imperator, they just resonate so deeply.
They really do. They feel vital, not just for understanding, like, the history of modern spiritualism, but they also seem to offer such timeless wisdom for navigating our own paths today, right? For discerning truth in what can be a pretty complex landscape of communication.
Absolutely. So that's our mission today, really. We want to unpack this incredible story. We'll trace Moses' journey from that skeptical start right through to becoming this key figure, receiving these significant teachings.
Yeah, we'll look into the different kinds of phenomena he witnessed, and some of them are really mind-bending. And then, most importantly, explore the core messages within spirit teachings. And we're doing all this, of course, through our shared lens as people who appreciate the reality of spirit communication, who know the wonders, but also, let's be honest, the challenges that come with it.
Okay, so let's start right at the beginning, tracing those first steps.
Hmm.
As you said, he began deeply skeptical. The source clearly states he saw spiritualism as trickery and fraud. But the key thing, I think, is that his mind wasn't closed.
No, not at all. He was willing to investigate, wasn't he? Actively looking for some germs of truth, even if he suspected it was mostly nonsense. That willingness, that critical openness, that's what cracked the door open.
Such an important point. It wasn't just diving in, it was a rigorous search. And he wasn't doing it totally in isolation either. The sources mention the influence of people around him, Mrs. Spear, for instance.
Right. She was impressed by that book, The Debatable Land, and got Moses to read it.
Yes, Robert Dale Owen's book, a really significant piece arguing for the reality of phenomena back then. And then there was Dr. Spear, her husband, physician. He sounded even more dismissive initially.
Yeah, the sources say he thought it was all just stuff and nonsense.
Pretty blunt. But Mrs. Spear managed to persuade him to actually attend sittings with Moses. So you have this little circle forming right there, which became this sort of testing ground for Moses's first real experiences.
So they started attending these sittings. The first really noteworthy ones mentioned are with a medium named Lottie Fowler back in spring 1872. Were those the big turning point?
They seem to have been significant initial encounters, yeah. But the material suggests it was the visits shortly after that to the medium Williams, crucially, with Dr. Spear also there, that really shifted things from just observation to actual conviction.
Oh, okay.
They became convinced, the sources say, that there was some force outside the medium at work. It wasn't just clever tricks. Something genuinely external was happening.
And then that conviction got a major boost almost right away, didn't it? There's talk of a remarkable seance soon after, held at Dr. Spear's own house, again with Williams mediating. What made that one stand out so much?
Well, the sources don't give us, like, a play-by-play of every single thing that happened in that specific seance. But the fact they flag it as remarkable and specifically say it strengthened conviction, suggests something really striking must have occurred. Something undeniable, maybe something personal to Moses and Spear, happening right there in the controlled setting of Spear's home. It really cemented that early feeling that they were dealing with something real and external.
Okay, so the phenomena is starting to convince him. But Moses wasn't just some blank slate. He had this deep, existing faith. The sources make it really clear this wasn't an easy overnight conversion to spiritualism. There was this arduous and prolonged struggle.
Oh, absolutely. And you can feel that struggle right in Spear teachings itself. He didn't just, flip a switch and abandon years of church doctrine he'd studied and believed in.
No way.
The teachings he started receiving directly challenged some core Orthodox ideas, and you can almost sense, reading the book, the intense intellectual and spiritual wrestling match going on inside him as he tried to make sense of these new realities alongside his old beliefs.
You really can. It gives the whole thing such a layer of authenticity, I think. Knowing these teachings weren't just passively downloaded, but they were questioned, debated, fought over within his own mind. But then, once he reached that point of resolution for himself, once he felt fully convinced of the reality of those teachings, and crucially, felt he could trust the truthfulness and integrity of his spirit guides, well, the sources say his faith in it, his zeal, never faltered after that.
That's the pivotal moment, isn't it? That deeply personal, undeniable experience leading to profound conviction. It's a pattern we see so often in genuine spiritual awakenings. And this certainty, born from both experience and that intense intellectual wrestling, directly fueled his mediumship, especially the automatic writing.
Yes, let's talk about that automatic writing. Because the sources give us this fascinating glimpse into how it actually developed. It wasn't like a finished book just appeared instantly. It started out, they say, very small and irregular.
Yeah, the description is that initially he had to write slowly and cautiously, almost watching his own hand move as if it had a mind of its own, like the intelligence was, learning to use the equipment. Or maybe he was learning to let go of control. It clearly wasn't smooth sailing at first.
Right, like the connection was being established, refined, but it changed over time. The writing became more and more minute, yet also incredibly very regular and beautifully formed. Some of it was even described as a specimen of calligraphy. That's amazing, isn't it? To think of script developing like that, getting more refined through this unseen influence.
It really is. It suggests both the developing skill of the spirits using his hand and maybe also Moses himself becoming a clearer, more refined channel over time. And for a while, it happened quite often. The writings frequently came, especially interestingly, during religious services.
Huh. Suggests maybe the state of mind or the atmosphere was conducive.
Could be, but, and this is crucial, he could by no means reckon on them. It wasn't like turning on a tap.
That lack of absolute control, that sounds familiar to anyone involved in mediumship, right? The energy, the connection, it isn't always just there on demand.
Exactly. And sadly, the messages did eventually stop coming through that way late in his life. The sources directly link this to ill health, which again points to how vital the physical condition is for this kind of communication. The body's energy seems fundamentally tied to the ability to channel effectively.
Absolutely. And while the automatic writing was the main way the teachings came through, the sources are clear that Moses experienced much more than just that. He encountered other forms of spirit manifestation and was apparently rarely without some kind of phenomenon happening, unless, again, his health was poor. He wasn't just a writing medium.
That's important context. It wasn't simply about receiving ideas intellectually. It was this whole interactive reality unfolding around him. And some of these physical phenomena described in the sources you sent, wow, the detail is striking. Take the objective lights.
Right. And these weren't just things he saw. Dr. Spear saw them too.
Yes, and the source makes a point of saying that both Moses and Spear were considered, pretty grounded, entirely unmediumistic temperaments when it came to subjective things like clairvoyance. So that adds weight to these lights being objective, right? They were described as rising through a solid mahogany tabletop. Can you just picture that? Light emerging from solid wood.
The description is almost forensic, trying to capture how strange it was. It's compared to seeing light through plain glass, but there was a specific hole it came out of, suggesting it was localized, piercingly bright.
And here's the really bizarre part, the thing that sets it apart from just, some kind of phosphorescence. The sources explicitly state that no matter how bright these lights shone, they never threw any radiance around them or illuminated the smallest thing nearby.
Wow. So pure light, Seen directly, but not interacting with the physical world in the way we expect light to.
Exactly. Seen through the wood, emerging from it, but not lighting up the table surface or anything else. That distinction is just profound.
Yeah.
It suggests something visible, but maybe existing on a different energetic level, not playing by normal physics rules.
Fascinating. Then there were also the subjective lights. These were seen clairvoyantly by Moses, Mrs. Spear, and others who sat with them sometimes.
And these sounded different. Described as large masses of luminous vapor floating around the room and assuming a variety of shapes. That sounds much more like the kind of ethereal forms many mediums perceive today, less physically anchored than those objective lights seemingly coming out of the table.
Okay, another major category described is the musical phenomena. Really distinct sounds. First, if you put your ear to the tabletop, the music seemed to be in the wood, not underneath it.
Again, like the objective lights, the sound source seemed to be within the solid material itself, not just coming up from below, like the wood itself was vibrating, becoming the instrument.
Wild. Then there was a sound like a violoncello, but apparently more powerful, more sonorous. The sources guess maybe like a cello played on a drum for extra resonance. And the really specific thing, this sound only came in single notes.
Yes, and it was used by one particular spirit intelligence, often apparently, to answer questions with just a single note, kind of like how raps might be used.
So specific sounds linked to specific communicators and even specific functions. Then there was the handbell sound, an exact imitation, and they made sure to check no actual bell in the room.
Right. And this sound also signaled a particular spirit's presence. And get this, it was described as moving around the room, even up to the ceiling.
An invisible bell ringing near the ceiling. That's quite an image.
Definitely demonstrates some kind of unseen intelligence manipulating energy in the physical space. And the last sound described, this one sounds truly extraordinary, and the Force admits it's exceedingly difficult to describe properly. It started like a soft tone of a clarinet, then grew louder and louder until it sounded like a trumpet blast, and then faded away into this long, drawn-out, melancholy wail.
Wow. And this incredibly dramatic, unique sound was always associated with one specific spirit.
These unique sound signatures for different spirits, that's a remarkable level of detail. And the sources point out something really important about all this music. The controlling spirits, despite the complexity of some sounds, apparently only produced single notes or short, isolated passages. They couldn't manifest complex, continuous melodies physically this way.
That limitation is interesting. It adds a layer of realism, maybe, suggests the sheer energetic difficulty of creating physical sound, or perhaps limitations in how the spirits could manipulate the physical world for sustained, complex musical performances.
It definitely feels like an honest reporting of the phenomenon, including its constraints. And this leads right into that discussion in the sources about music and spiritual conditions. They connect musical ability, like maybe Dr. Spear's son had, to one's spiritual state. The idea of the music of the spheres. It's not just poetry here.
No, it's presented as something real, achievable, but only when the spiritual elements are in harmonious arrangement. Musical inspiration, genuine inspiration, flows best under those conditions.
And conversely, the physical body can actually be a bar, a hindrance, blocking the spirit's ability to fully receive or express that musical soul stuff. They make a clear distinction between just sound and the soul in music. The real depth needs that spiritual connection.
It really elevates music, doesn't it? From just sound waves to this profound expression of inner harmony.
Absolutely. And just looping back quickly to the physical phenomena in general, the sources mentioned they did happen, even if the main focus was the teachings. But there's a telling detail. These physical things were often ruder and more violent when conditions weren't ideal.
Like when someone was replete with food, which is such a practical, fascinating note for any medium or sitter today. It suggests your physical state directly impacts the kind of energy or intelligence that can manifest.
Totally. The desirable manifestations, the ones linked to higher influences perhaps, are described as delicate and beautiful, implying they need that finer, more balanced physical and energetic environment in the room and in the medium.
It really highlights how sensitive the whole process is, the medium's body, the circle's energy. Temperance, moderation, they're not just moral points, they're most technical requirements for facilitating higher communication.
Exactly. So Moses has these incredible experiences, this whole spectrum of phenomena convincing him something real is happening. But the absolute core of his work and what your sources focus on so powerfully is the teachings themselves and the communications from the spirit known as imperator. They're explicitly called a distinct epoch in his life.
Yeah, that really stands out. These weren't just random messages dropping in. The sources link them to intense spiritual exaltation, but also strenuous conflict and intervals of depression. It sounds like a really profound, intense period for him, internally and externally.
A spiritual battleground almost, as he received these messages that were fundamentally reshaping his understanding of everything.
Yeah.
An imperator emerges as the absolute central figure, the chief guide and guardian of Moses' spirit, described as a servant for God, the minister of the Most High. This isn't just any spirit popping in. This is an intelligence with a clear mission and authority in Moses' life.
And a proactive one, too. Imperators strongly urged and eventually enforced stopping the sittings when the conditions weren't right. That shows a real sense of responsibility, protecting the medium and the integrity of the communication.
Definitely. Though the sources also mention other spirits communicated too, including a friend who had recently passed.
So it wasn't just Imperator speaking.
No, it seems like a collective effort, but Imperator was clearly the chief, the one orchestrating things, providing the main oversight. Different intelligences might present arguments or messages, but under Imperator's overall guidance.
And Moses himself, how did he perceive it? He was adamant, wasn't he?
Very. He felt he had forcible evidence of external intelligence, often working, interestingly, against his own ingrained beliefs or expectations. He talked about elaborate plans being carried out, convincing and logical arguments being used, things he felt were clearly beyond his own conscious mind.
Which brings us straight to that huge question in mediumship, spirit identity. How do you know who you're talking to? The sources detail the evidence they received for individual survival after death, like written messages that sometimes replicated the handwriting, spelling, even the specific phrasing of the person they claimed to be.
And that was backed up by verbal messages through his guide, and even messages painstakingly wrapped out. The sources claimed the factual information given was invariably, literally, and exactly true, often about people the sitters didn't even know. That's strong evidential stuff, if accurate.
And what I found really interesting was the point that the cases seemed selected by design. It wasn't like Moses could just say, hey, can you prove X? And they'd do it. It felt more like the spirits were providing the evidence they thought was appropriate or possible.
Yeah, less like fulfilling requests, more like presenting a curated case. They give those amazing examples too, like the communication from Norton, an old alchemist, that came through in this curious, archaic hand. Apparently, Moses struggled later to verify the details, suggesting the info wasn't easily accessible to him.
Right, not something he could just Google, even back then.
Yeah.
And then the even more extraordinary one from an old Egyptian prophet of Ra at On, that included hieroglyphics and specific details about Egyptian theology. Again, knowledge seemingly external to Moses that was later checked out as historically accurate.
Powerful stuff. Yet even with all that, the sources are refreshingly honest about Moses' own ongoing struggles with doubt. He kept wanting that concrete mathematical proof, the kind of undeniable evidence you could show anyone. It's so relatable, isn't it? Trying to bridge these worlds and wanting something solid.
Totally. And Imperator's response to that is just so profound, especially for anyone grappling with similar feelings today. Imperator basically said, look, that kind of proof isn't always possible, and actually it's not always even good for you spiritually.
Right. Instead, they appealed to Moses' calmer and truer self, asking him to consider the internal evidence, the coherence, the moral quality, the spiritual resonance of the teachings themselves.
And they pointed out that his rising doubts, while maybe understandable, were acting like barriers, like fogs, actually hindering the communication. That rings so true in mediumship, doesn't it? A resistant or overly skeptical mind can genuinely block the flow. The proof, ultimately, had to be felt and integrated internally.
Okay, so we've looked at Moses' journey, the phenomena, the source of the messages. Now, let's really get into the meat of it. What were these core teachings? What was the actual message Imperator and the others were trying to get across? The sources lay out some really key themes, starting with the Spirit's own mission.
Yeah, they were pretty explicit about their purpose, weren't they, to spread progressive truth? Especially, they felt, at that particular time in history when humanity really needed the shift in understanding. They saw themselves as actively pushing back against the hosts of the adversaries.
And they describe this work as greater than men think, which suggests it's not just about comforting individuals, but part of some much bigger, ongoing spiritual evolution, maybe even a battle happening on a grand scale. These communications were seen as a deliberate, strategic intervention in that process.
This idea of progressive truth seems central to their whole view of revelation. They saw it as continuous, right? Not something that happened once and got locked into a book.
Exactly. And they really lamented how this ongoing revelation gets distorted over time by human hands, obscured by human figments and man's glosses.
So human interpretations, traditions, dogmas, they muddy the waters, basically. They even said the work of destruction must precede that of construction, meaning you have to clear away the old errors and misunderstandings before the new, clearer truth can really take root.
And revelation, in their view, is always tailored. It's given only as much as humanity or the individual medium can bear it. It comes through a human filter, so it's inevitably limited by that person's capacity, their own knowledge, their freedom from old biases or fetters. Revelation simply cannot be in advance of capacity. That's such a powerful idea for understanding why truth seems to manifest differently across times and cultures.
That framework leads right into one of the most central and probably the most challenging and for Moses themes, the critique of Orthodox theology. Not a critique of God or spirituality itself, but of specific man-made ideas that had become rigid dogma.
Absolutely. And one of the biggest shifts, I imagine, was this radical rethinking of God's nature. Moving away from centuries of doctrine that often painted God as stern, judgmental, even vengeful. These teachings present God purely as a loving father. They hammer home that love is the only thing that enters his dealings.
That completely cuts against the idea of an angry, jealous tyrant who needs appeasing through sacrifice or blind obedience. It's a direct rejection of those, frankly, crude human projections onto the divine that make God seem cruel or petty. That shift alone is massive.
And they also threw out the idea of some arbitrary election of a favored few. No, these are the elect, the ones who achieve spiritual advancement, do it by working out their own salvation through natural spiritual laws. It's about effort and alignment, not random divine favor.
And they had no time for blind faith either. Just agreeing with doctrines, they argued, doesn't magically erase sin or guarantee salvation. What matters is cultivating a trustful, receptive spirit, genuine openness, not perpetual suspicion or just nodding along to dogma. Reason was crucial.
Heaven gets a makeover too. Forget the fabled, dreamy heaven of eternal inactivity or endless, monotonous singing, which, let's face it, sounds pretty boring to many people. Instead, it's presented as a sphere of progressive usefulness and growth. Dynamic, purposeful, continued evolution, not just sitting on a cloud.
And hell, similarly, isn't a place of eternal, inescapable torture. It's described more as a state of suffering that results directly from your own choices, your own sin, your misalignment with spiritual law. A state that can lead to purification and eventual progress, although they did suggest that for those who persistently refuse the good, there might be a fading of identity. It's consequence, not infinite punishment.
A huge, empowering, maybe even a bit daunting takeaway is the relentless focus on personal responsibility. Man makes his own future, stamps his own character, suffers for his own sins, and works out his own salvation. Period. No cosmic scapegoat, no easy way out. You do the work.
And judgment isn't some big final court date. It's ceaseless, ongoing. Your spirit, through its choices and actions now and later, literally fits itself for its next state. You go where you belong, of necessity, drawn by your own spiritual gravity, not sent by some external judge.
The concept of the devil also gets nuanced. Not one single supervillain, but chiefs, many who govern, suggesting hierarchies of lower, less evolved, obstructive intelligences, and they specifically warn against the idea that there's no evil, calling that an open device of the evil ones, a trick to make people drop their guard. Adversaries are real, they resist progress, they fight truth, and they're often spirits who got stuck, earthbound, didn't move on.
What about the Bible? How did they view Scripture?
Not as a single, perfect, divinely dictated text, more like a record of humanity's gradual growth and knowledge about the divine, a growth they said is easily discernible if you read it critically. Inspiration is divine, yes, but the medium, the writer, is human. So every sacred text inevitably reflects the mind and limitations of the person it came through.
Which makes it dangerous, they argued, to cling to plenary inspiration, the idea that every single word, especially in translation, is infallible, or to just pull out isolated verses without understanding their context. You need a more discerning approach.
And dogma itself. They saw it as something that grew up over time, assumptions hardening into essential beliefs, defanned, often burying the original, simpler truth under layers of man's glosses. They pointed out how, historically, the people who try to clear away that clutter and get back to basics are often condemned by the institutions invested in the dogma.
Ouch. They didn't mince words about theology either, did they? Calling it a byword full of bitterest invective, unchristian bitterness, unblushing misrepresentation, accusing it of stifling people's natural holy instincts. The promise was pretty radical. The shackles which priestcraft has hung around struggling souls shall be knocked off.
It's powerful stuff. And all this critique clears the ground for what they presented as the true spirit creed. And its absolute bedrock, reason. Faith needs reasonable grounds. Reason is the ultimate judge. That's a direct challenge to traditions emphasizing blind faith above all. Blind faith can be no substitute for reasoning trust.
God is the loving Father, knowable through his actions, through reality, not through confusing metaphysical sophistries. Man is the arbiter of his own destiny, judged by his works, his actions, not just his beliefs.
So the real incentive to live a holy life isn't fear of punishment or hope of reward based on belief alone. It's understanding consequence. Every action matters. Sin leads to future sorrow and hard work. Every word, every deed has this ceaselessly enlarging effect you're accountable for. That understanding, they argued, is actually more likely to deter sin than doctrines offering easy forgiveness through belief. It installs a deep sense of personal spiritual responsibility.
Progress is seen as absolutely essential for happiness, not just a nice bonus. There's no endpoint. Spiritual life is continuous striving, continuous growth. Duty is threefold: to God, to humanity, and to yourself, guided by inner instinct and spiritual teaching. Fulfilling that duty brings happiness and fuels progress.
And religion itself isn't just about Sunday service or believing the right things. It has two active sides. Pointing towards God, yes, but also pointing towards humanity service, action. It's a religion of acts and habits, not just words and fitful faith. The goal is refining your whole being, body and soul, making it pure, progressive, true, sublimating the spiritual nature.
They also talked about a spiritualized Christianity, didn't they? Trying to do for Christianity what they felt Jesus did for Judaism.
Exactly. Take the old forms and spiritualize their meaning. They suggested Jesus himself didn't actually claim the unique, absolute divine status the church later imposed through dogma.
And the atonement. They saw truth in it, but rejected the common interpretation of it being a literal sacrifice to appease an angry God. The goal was a vibrant, spiritualized religion, calling people away from dead formalism toward the lovely symbolism of angel teaching.
They viewed Jesus' life itself through this lens of spirit progress. An incarnation, yes, but maybe not the only one ever. His life, they suggested, prepared him for his mission through direct angelic instruction and constant connection with the spirit world, much like a highly developed medium, really. His life becomes a template for spiritual progress, from being embodied on earth to achieving liberation from its limitations.
Even the big Christian holidays got reinterpreted. Easter wasn't just about resurrection, but the manifest vision of eternal life. Whitsuntide, or Pentecost, wasn't just tongues of fire, but the outpouring of spiritual truth. Christmas maybe representing the completion of his earthly work, not just his birth. Deeper spiritual meanings under the surface.
And this wider view extended way beyond Christianity. They were adamant that truth is the exclusive heritage of no man, of no sect. It underlies all sorts of philosophies and religions. They even named names: Athenodorus, Plotinus, Al-Ghazali, Aquilini thinkers from different eras and traditions, suggesting they all tapped into aspects of this universal spiritual truth.
It reinforces that core idea. Universal, progressive revelation happens throughout history, even if it gets clouded by human error along the way. The key is to look for the spark of truth in other beliefs. Focus on the good, not just cling rigidly to your own way. Divine truth, they said, is actually too bright for human eyes.
Yeah, it must be tempered by an earthly medium, filtered through us, otherwise it would just blind the unaccustomed eye. They even pointed to the ancient Egyptians as having deep spiritual wisdom in their theology, giving an Egyptian example of the Trinity idea, showing it wasn't exclusive to Christianity but had historical roots elsewhere. That broad perspective is really key.
Okay, let's shift back a bit to the more practical side, the dynamics of the spirit world itself. The sources say spirit action is universal, constantly happening, constantly influencing us. But we determine, through our choices and mindset, whether that influence is beneficial or not.
Right. Higher spirits, they claimed, actively work to influence our thoughts, suggest positive ideas, even arrange circumstances subtly to guide humanity towards progress.
But then there's the other side, the lower spheres. These are described as places where undeveloped, earthbound spirits gather. Heavy, negative atmospheres filled with misery and guilt. Apparently, there are even separations within these spheres based on the degree of negativity or vice.
And for those who just persistently refuse the good, refuse to progress, the teaching suggests they might sink so low they could eventually lose their conscious identity altogether. That's a pretty sobering thought about the consequences of spiritual stagnation.
Which leads right back to those very real dangers we sometimes discuss. adversaries, and personation. These lower spirits, or adversaries, are drawn to negativity, sin, intense passion. They're described as organized, actively working to retard progress.
And one of their main tricks, a ready device, is apparently to impersonate truthful, trusted spirits. Why? To sow doubt and fraud, to deliberately derail genuine communication and spiritual work. The sources mention that the teachings did offer guidance on how to know a personating spirit, which is obviously crucial info for any medium, though the specifics aren't in this outline. Discernment is paramount.
They also make that distinction. The phenomenal, the flashy physical stuff is ultimately illusory. It's temporary, a means to an end maybe, but not the core reality. The spiritual is what's real and lasting. The deeper truths, the higher revealings, are reserved for those who develop the capacity to perceive beyond just the phenomena.
And specific warnings are given about mental states. Avoid immoderate, unreasoning, excited frames of mind. Why? Because those states lower your vibration and attract undeveloped, potentially troublesome spirits. Even things like national holidays, associated with excess and lower passions, were flagged as risky times for negative influence.
It all comes back to the importance of suitable mediums and circles, doesn't it? The sources really stress that you need the right conditions for spirits of integrity, the higher guides, to work effectively and safely. Selecting a truly good medium is described as a difficult task.
They list the qualities needed.
Yeah.
Receptive, free from prejudice, not stuck in old errors, truthful, earnest, unselfish, loving. The medium's mind shouldn't be positive antagonistic, actively resisting the influence, nor proud obtruding, meaning letting their own ego or ideas interfere.
And the harmony within the circle of sitters is just as vital. Doubts, disagreements, bad vibes among the participants, these act as blockages, hindering the spirit connection. Best results come with a healthy medium, clear senses, and a passive, receptive state of mind. And that practical tip again, avoid sittings when sick, suffering, or stuffed with food, because that attracts the grosser, lower energies. Moderation in life helps create the right vessel.
There's also that strong warning against idle curiosity, just asking random questions out of boredom or wanting trivial proofs. That attracts spirits on a similar level, often undeveloped or mischievous ones, not the higher guides. You need a reverent, earnest mind, genuinely seeking truth and growth to connect with higher sources.
And what about the balance between physical mediumship and actual spiritual growth?
Yeah, they address that directly. Physical phenomena, the marvels, are acknowledged as sometimes necessary, especially early on, to convince certain minds that spirit reality is even possible. But it absolutely shouldn't be the end goal or the main focus. Encouraging really strong, violent physical power, which often comes from lower, undeveloped spirits closer to the physical plane, is seen as a huge risk.
A risk. How so?
Because, the teachings warn, it attracts spirits you really don't want around. They even call the overfocus on physical stuff a diabolical device for paralyzing our work. Like, it's a deliberate distraction tactic by lower forces to keep people stuck on the surface level, hindering real spiritual progress and the reception of higher truths. The focus has to shift from the phenomenon to the message, the meaning, the growth.
Okay, one last practical area, prayer. How did they view prayer?
Not as formal, repetitive recitations or trying to bargain with God. Real prayer, they said, is the heart cry. Spontaneous, impulsive, a genuine yearning reaching out to the spirit friends and guides who hover near. When it's authentic like that, it brings rich spiritual blessing.
So it's more about that heartfelt connection.
Exactly. Angel messengers are described as being right there, ready to help when that genuine call goes out. Prayer isn't about changing immutable laws. It's about aligning yourself with those laws and asking for help within that framework. It's not about morbid self-analysis or forced begging. To the truly spiritual soul, the one genuinely seeking, spiritual gifts come in richest measure.
And the answer might not always be what you asked for, right? Because granting the specific request might actually cause harm in the bigger picture.
Precisely. Frequent, genuine communion, that heartfelt prayer, helps keep the connection strong, helps the spirits draw close.
Okay, so given just how deep, how broad, and frankly how challenging many of these teachings were, directly confronting the mainstream beliefs of his time, it's really no wonder that Stainton Moses himself faced huge challenges in this ongoing struggle, even while he was receiving them. The sources are very upfront about his internal conflict.
Oh yeah. They detail his own objections, his dissatisfaction at times. He found parts of it really difficult, especially around proving identity, the whole nature of Christ thing, and that constant yearning for external, objective, mathematical evidence that was separate from his own experience.
He actually recorded feeling like his mind was disturbed by it all. And he looked around at what other spiritualists were doing and often found it vague and frequently contemptible, which kind of highlights how unique and maybe how jarring these specific imperator teachings felt, even to him, compared to the general scene back then. And that nagging doubt, was this all just coming from his own subconscious, kept popping up.
And Imperator's responses to these doubts are such a key part of the story. Imperator acknowledged the struggle, saying it was a phase Moses had to get through, but was also firm that the doubts themselves were creating a barrier, blocking clear reception. Moses was urged to actively use his will, do an honest and unprejudiced survey of the proof he had already received.
Patience was key, Imperator advised. Impatient attempts to force matters on do but cause annoyance. And the message about proof stayed the same. The mathematical kind wasn't the point, wasn't even necessarily good for his spiritual path. The real value lay in the internal truth of the teachings, backed by his own accumulated experience.
And that conflict with adversaries wasn't just some abstract theological point in the teachings. It was presented as something directly impacting Moses. He was told he was feeling the reflex of that struggle inside himself. Maybe that explains those periods of depression or mental turmoil he mentioned. This whole spiritual battle was framed as the necessary darkness that precedes the dawn.
Wow. And the adversary's influence was described as great and widespread. There's even that chilling warning that these negative forces can drive mediums to madness. That really drives home the potential dangers in this work if you're not properly guided or protected. It's not just an intellectual game. You're navigating a reality with real opposing forces.
And that ties right back to the warnings about unsuitable mediumship in circles. The sources make this point powerfully by using Moses' own experience as an example. His own circle eventually became so useless and inharmonious that Imperator, his main guide, had to withdraw direct communication through that specific group.
So it wasn't just theoretical advice, it happened to him. Even with a top-tier medium and high-level guides, if the circle conditions fall apart the harmony, the intention, the higher connection can be severed. The risks are real, especially if the guides involved aren't suitable or have negative intentions.
Finally, the sources touch on something quite moving. The cost of the work, not just for the medium, but for the spirits doing the communicating. Those spirits from higher realms who choose to come down and minister on earth, they experience our dense atmosphere as cold and chilling, heavy with misery and guilt.
They're described as leaving this place of God's light and truth to enter the relative outer darkness of Earth's spiritual environment. And in doing this work, they actually imbibe somewhat of your grossness. They take on some of our heavy energy.
The sources say they sometimes complain about how difficult and draining it is, this sacrifice. But crucially, they do not faint. It highlights their incredible dedication, their willingness to endure this discomfort to help us progress, despite the personal cost to them.
So as we start to wrap up this deep dive, the sources give us a little sketch of Stainton Moses' character, according to his biographer. Beyond what was apparently an outwardly quiet life, his inner life, his character was huge. Individuality and force of character were immense. Ability was quite out of the common. Incredible versatility of his talents.
Sounds like a real powerhouse, intellectually and spiritually. No subject was too dry for him, nothing too unimportant if it related to truth. He had this immense energy for spiritualistic research, juggling it alongside his demanding day jobs in teaching and journalism. Just his correspondence alone answering questions, guiding people must have been enormous.
And apparently he also spent time privately visiting many influential people of his era, figures from society, politics, science, literature, art, though their names were kept confidential during their lifetimes. That says a lot, doesn't it? About the serious respect he commanded even behind closed doors.
Definitely. His death in 1892 was called a terrible shock and a huge loss, not just personally, but specifically for the cause of spiritualism generally.
Right.
He was seen as this anchor of integrity and intelligence in a field that could often be, well, chaotic.
The sources also mention the cessation of that intense period of automatic writing the teachings proper. The sustained vigor apparently broke around 1874. The power came back sometimes, but more sporadically. The feeling was that the main end in view had been obtained for that specific phase of communication.
Yeah. Even though he wrote more afterwards, the gaps became longer until around 1879, when that intense automatic writing method was practically abandoned for an easier and simpler one. It really seems like that core body of spirit teachings was the main delivery for that period.
And Stainton Moses' own final thoughts on these teachings, as presented in the material, are really quite humble and telling, I think. He offered them to the world not as his own infallible gospel, but as specimens of influence brought powerfully to bear upon an independent mind from without.
Exactly. He basically says, look, read them, see if they commend themselves to your own reason, your own intuition. Accept or dismiss them based on that. But he stresses that the undeniable true significance for him was recognizing this sustained and successful effort of intelligence apart from a human brain, influencing someone, him, who claimed no special merit other than having tried really, really hard and honestly to find the truth.
What a testament to his integrity, right? And that clear line he drew between his own mind and what he felt was this external intelligence guiding his hand.
So wrapping up this incredible journey into Stainton Moses and spirit teachings, we've covered so much ground, from his initial skepticism through those mind-blowing phenomena to the profound, challenging, deeply reasoned teachings, especially from Imperator.
Yeah, we've touched on that core spiritualized creed. A God of pure love, reason, and responsibility trumping blind faith, the crucial role of our actions and continuous progress, and seeing revelation as this ongoing, living thing.
And again, we really have you, our listener, to thank for sending these sources our way. It allowed us to dive deep into such a foundational figure and work, and importantly, to look at it through our shared perspective, appreciating the reality of spirit communication.
Absolutely. For those of us who, continue to sit, to listen, to seek that connection and guidance from the unseen, Moses's experiences feel so relevant. His encounters with phenomena, his relationship with his guides, his own wrestling with doubt, that very real struggle against what he saw as adversarial forces. It all resonates, doesn't it?
It really does. It reminds us that this path, while unique to each of us, is an ancient one. Pioneers like Moses walked it, grappled with the same big questions, encountered similar energies, both helpful and challenging, that we might encounter today.
It underlines the timelessness of the quest and just how important discernment and sincere intention are when you're seeking truth from spirit sources.
And it leaves us with this really powerful thought right from the source material, kind of summing up the subtlety of how spiritual truth might be transmitted. Remember that line about divine truth needing to be tempered by an earthly medium, darkened somewhat lest it blind the unaccustomed eye.
Or the idea that truth is a special creation for a special want, an answer from the Great Spirit to the yearning aspiration of your soul.
How does that land with you? This idea that maybe truth isn't always this rigid, one-size-fits-all thing, but potentially a personal revelation, carefully tailored by higher intelligence to fit your specific capacity, your stage of development, your soul's deepest questions.
It's definitely something to sit with, isn't it? A lot to ponder there. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive today.
Absolutely. Until next time, keep seeking, keep questioning, keep exploring, and always trust that quiet voice within and those guides who approach you with genuine wisdom and love.